January 10, 2025. The Friday that a month ago was marked by the shattering the silence from Ethan Baker, the 7-year-old's 911 call that saved his sister from his own dad. The crisp autumn air stirred the leaves along Cedar Street, painting the sidewalks in shades of gold and rust. In one of the tidy suburban houses near Boston, 7-year-old Ethan Baker sat on the floor of his bedroom, lining up his Hot Wheels cars in a precise rainbow of colors. The late afternoon sun filtered through the window blinds, creating stripes of light and shadow across the carpet his mother had picked out 3 years earlier. From downstairs, a gentle clatter drifted upward, pots and pans echoing against the counters, the sound of vegetables meeting the cutting board. Richard, his stepfather, was making dinner. Ethan couldn't help glancing at the slightly open doorway. Moments ago he'd heard his sister Lily hurry by. She'd barely spoken to him for days, ever since she had started retreating into her room, hidden under a perpetually oversized sweater. He remembered when things were different, when Lily would laugh and play with him, racing toy cars across the living room floor, or reading silly stories using all sorts of exaggerated voices. Those days felt distant now, overtaken by hushed arguments, odd silences, and an undercurrent of tension Ethan was too young to name but old enough to feel. All at once Richard's voice boomed up from downstairs. "Lily, come and set the table, now?" Ethan hesitated, placing the last of his Hot Wheels into formation. He crept toward the hallway, curious about his sister's reaction. Lily trudged out of her room, her shoulders bowed forward as if she were trying to vanish. She walked past him in silence, not meeting his eyes, and disappeared down the stairs. Ethan followed quietly, stopping partway so he could see into the kitchen without drawing attention. Richard stood at the stove, his back tense, stirring a sauce with swift, irritated motions. He was in his late 30s, tall and robust, with dark hair that had only begun to show streaks of gray at the temples. To the neighbors and Ethan's classmates, he was Mr. Cooper, the friendly middle school teacher who helped coach community baseball. But at home he seemed different, harsher, unpredictable. "I said set the table?" Richard barked, glancing over his shoulder at Lily. She fumbled with a stack of plates from the cupboard, a single fork slipping to the floor in her haste. Sorry," Lily mumbled, bending to retrieve it. Ethan noticed how her hands shook. "Pick it up properly," Richard snapped, eyes flicking toward her. "Stop being clumsy." Lily carefully rose, placing the dropped fork in the sink and grabbing a fresh one from the drawer. In 2 quick strides, Richard was looming over her. Lily winced, bracing herself for a reprimand. "What's going on with you?" he demanded in a low, tight voice. "Your mother told me about the grade you got on that math quiz." "An 80. "I'll try harder," Lily whispered, her hair veiling part of her face. "Try harder?" Richard echoed, tone dripping with contempt. "You're lucky your mother works her fingers to the bone for this household. You think she wants to come home and hear about your slipping grades?" Ethan gripped the banister. He'd been told off before for interrupting when Richard spoke to Lily. Still, he ached to say something in her defense. Instead, his words stuck in his throat. A car engine growled in the driveway and the front door clicked open. His mother, Grace Baker, had arrived. Her weary voice floated through the hallway before she even stepped inside. "I brought groceries." She entered to find Lily setting the table while Richard resumed stirring the sauce, face now relaxed into an almost pleasant smile. Everything seemed disturbingly normal, as though the sharpness in his voice had never existed. "Something smells delicious," Grace remarked, setting the grocery bags down. She looked exhausted in her scrubs, hair tied into a frayed ponytail. She kissed Lily's cheek in passing, then turned to Richard. "Just my twist on chicken," he said warmly, the tension disappearing from his features like the flick of a switch. "Lily's been helping, haven't you?" Lily nodded mutely. Ethan stayed on the stairs, the banister pressed against his cheek, feeling like an outsider in his own home. Even at 7, he sensed that grown-ups had an uncanny way of overlooking the obvious when it was uncomfortable. He couldn't reconcile how different Richard's tone was the moment his mother entered. Slowly, Ethan climbed back up to his room, hugging the stuffed dinosaur on his bed and wishing things felt right again. That night, Ethan tossed and turned, listening to the soft hum of the heater and the distant hooting of an owl. Through the wall, he caught faint sounds from Lily's room, uneven breathing and occasional sniffles. She was crying, trying not to but unable to keep it all in. Ethan wanted desperately to go to her, as she used to come to him whenever nightmares took over his sleep. But a sense of dread kept him pinned in place, as if stepping out of his room would shatter the fragile peace in the house. The next morning, the sunlight broke through Lily's blinds, carving stripes of illumination across her bedroom walls. She pulled on the same oversized sweater and tugged the sleeves over her hands. The greenish bruise near her wrist was nearly gone, but she didn't feel safe leaving it uncovered. "Lily," her mother called. "Time for breakfast, Richard's dropping you both off." Anxiety knotted Lily's stomach. She grabbed her backpack and went downstairs. In the kitchen, Ethan was already finishing a bowl of cereal, swinging his legs beneath the chair. Grace stood by the counter, a to-go mug of coffee in hand, looking at her watch with a pained expression. "You need to eat, Lil," her mother urged, gesturing toward the kitchen table. "I'm not really hungry," Lily mumbled, glancing at Ethan. Her brother offered her a sympathetic look, but neither said a word. Richard, flipping through some papers, shot Lily a warning glance. "It won't kill you to eat. You already quit soccer, don't need you slacking in other areas." Grace's eyes flashed with concern. "You quit the team? Since when?" "It was recent," Lily murmured. "I just didn't feel like playing anymore." Her mother looked surprised, but Richard placed a hand on Grace's shoulder. "Kids change, Grace. Let's not turn this into a big deal," he said in a calm, measured voice. Then to Lily his tone shifted subtly. "Get your things. I have a meeting at school this morning." The car ride was subdued. Richard dropped Ethan at the elementary school first, barely waiting for him to step onto the curb before driving away. Lily spotted Ethan's worried face in the rearview mirror as he waved goodbye. She tried to wave back, but the car lurched forward too quickly. Within minutes, they arrived at the middle school campus where Richard taught history. Instead of pulling into the drop-off area, he turned into the staff parking lot and coasted into a quiet corner spot. He twisted in the driver's seat to face her. "Lily, look at me." She forced herself to lift her gaze, stomach roiling with nerves. "I heard about that math quiz and I've seen your latest progress reports. This is unacceptable. You're embarrassing me." Her mouth felt like sandpaper. "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix anything. If you pull stunts like these again, there'll be consequences. Do you get that?" She managed to nod, eyes fixed on her backpack. "Now," he said, leaning closer, "no more whining, no more telling your little sob stories to friends or teachers, and definitely no more dropping your grades. If you try to blame me for your problems or if I hear any rumors, we'll have a serious problem, you and I." Tears stung at the corners of Lily's eyes, but she blinked them back. She had no words left. "Go," Richard said, unlocking the door. She fled the car, heart hammering in her chest, and didn't look back as she darted through the parking lot. Surrounding her were the everyday scenes of school life. Kids laughing and talking, teachers sipping coffee, the routine chatter of a typical morning. Lily felt like an imposter among them, carrying a secret she couldn't share. In first period English, she tried to drown herself in the reading assignment, but her mind kept replaying Richard's voice. She wanted to raise her hand, offer an idea, or ask a question, anything to distract herself, but fear clamped her throat shut. After class, her friend Sophie caught up with her near the lockers. "Lily, you've missed soccer for a whole week," Sophie said, concerned. "Coach asked about you yesterday." "It's nothing," Lily mumbled, her eyes on the scuffed hallway floor. "Just busy." "I know that's not true." "You're not yourself anymore," Sophie pressed softly. Did I do something wrong?" Lily shook her head, then rushed off to her next class before Sophie could dig deeper. She clutched her books to her chest as though they could shield her from everything swirling in her world. That afternoon, Lily walked home alone. The crisp air carried the smell of fallen leaves, and the sky hung pale and sun-washed. Each step felt like a countdown to seeing Richard again, and her body tensed with every gust of wind. She thought about her younger brother, sweet Ethan, who still believed in heroes. Lately, Lily wondered if any heroes truly existed. No one seemed able to protect them. At 7:30 that evening, Ethan hovered over a bowl of cereal, pouring milk so carefully that it seemed a monumental task. Lily was sitting across from him, finishing the meager remains of her own meal. Richard's voice called from another room, his tone impatient. "Lily, get up here. I need your help grading these tests. You know something about failing, don't you?" Ethan noticed Lily's spoon quiver at the remark. She stood, shoulders rigid, and walked upstairs. The moment she disappeared, Ethan felt a pang of dread. He kept replaying a memory from a safety talk at school. If you suspect someone is in danger, you can always call 911. Minutes later, muffled shouts filtered down through the living room ceiling. Ethan froze. He recognized the sound of Lily crying, trying desperately to hold it in. Then came a low thump, followed by something that might have been Lily's muffled plea or the sound of her struggling to breathe. Suddenly, Ethan's decision was made. The phone was in the kitchen drawer and he tiptoed to retrieve it, his heart hammering. He could still hear Richard's raised voice between the crashes and thuds. The cordless phone slipped in his sweaty hand, but he steadied it long enough to push the number 911. It rang twice before a calm dispatcher answered. 911, what's your emergency? Ethan's voice trembled. My sister, she's in trouble, my stepdad's hurting her. The dispatcher's voice softened. I understand. You did the right thing by calling. Can you tell me your name and where you are? He swallowed hard. Ethan Baker. 247 Cedar Street. As he spoke, he heard another cry from upstairs, Lily's voice raw and frightened. That was all the confirmation he needed. Ethan cradled the phone, listening as the dispatcher told him help was on the way. In that moment, the weight of Richard's anger felt bigger than anything Ethan could handle. But he remembered the caretaker's words at school. Sometimes you do the scary thing because it's right. He stayed on the line, tears burning at the corners of his eyes, waiting for the flashing lights and sirens that would soon converge on Cedar Street, sirens summoned by a 7-year-old boy who couldn't watch his sister suffer any longer. And in that single call, everything about their family's carefully maintained image would unravel, changing the course of their lives forever. A sudden crash from upstairs made Ethan flinch, pressing the cordless phone closer to his ear. Please hurry, he whispered, voice trembling. It's my stepdad, Richard. He's hurting my sister, hurting Lily. On the other end of the line, the dispatcher's voice stayed calm. Officers are on their way, Ethan. Can you stay on the phone with me until they arrive? Before Ethan could reply, he heard the unmistakable wail of sirens in the distance. Red and blue lights began to dance across the walls, illuminating the kitchen in urgent flashes. They're here, Ethan breathed, relief and fear warring in his chest. I hear the police. Good job, Ethan, the dispatcher said. Find a safe place. Do not try to get between them. Ethan curled up further inside the pantry, holding the phone against him like a shield. He could hear heavy footsteps pounding up the porch steps, then a thunderous noise as the front door burst open. Multiple voices filled the house, authoritative and quick. Police. Everyone remain where you are. Richard's voice cut through the chaos, but it sounded different now, smoother, almost charming. There's some mistake here, he was saying. Everything's fine. A female officer spoke with terse clarity. Officers upstairs, now. Ethan crept to the pantry door, peering out just in time to see more uniformed figures race up the staircase. Then came a shocked gasp, followed by someone shouting for medical assistance. Moments later, paramedics rushed through the doorway with a stretcher, hurrying toward the stairs. Stunned, Ethan watched as another pair of officers confronted Richard in the living room, handcuffing him. Richard's face was twisted in anger, and when he caught sight of Ethan, he spat out words the boy couldn't entirely make out, but they felt venomous enough to make him recoil. One of the officers gave Richard a hard shove toward the door. Don't look at him, another officer said firmly, stepping in front of Ethan. You did the right thing, son. Then Lily appeared, carried on the stretcher by paramedics. Ethan caught a glimpse of her tear-stained face, bruised and swollen. Their eyes locked for one fragile moment. She mouthed something, perhaps his name, and the relief in her gaze was unmistakable. In that single look, Ethan felt the smallest spark of pride amid the chaos. He had done what no one else had. She needs her mom, Lily mumbled, her words barely audible. We're notifying your mother now, promised a female officer trailing behind the stretcher. She'll be here soon. As the paramedics maneuvered Lily through the front door, the house itself seemed to sigh, releasing a stifling tension. Richard was let out seconds later, still cursing under his breath. Ethan stood there, drained of the adrenaline that had driven him to make the call. An officer with kind eyes knelt down beside him. You're Ethan, right? He asked softly. I'm Officer Mike. Would you like to tell me what happened tonight? Ethan's gaze flicked to the phone still clutched in his small hands. He thought of Lily's bruises and of all the times he'd seen her shrink into herself, the sharp words Richard hurled at her. Taking a shaky breath, Ethan began to speak. His voice was quiet at first, but it gained strength as he described what he'd witnessed, the gradual changes in Lily, the terror, the bruises he'd spotted by accident. He described Richard's two faces, the warm, respectable teacher in public, and the man who spewed cruelty when no one else was watching. Through the front window, Ethan could see the swirl of red and blue lights reflecting on the growing crowd of neighbors. The night felt colder than before, and he imagined his mother arriving at any moment to find her home torn apart by secrets. He wasn't sure how she would react, but a new feeling was settling inside him, a sense of strength. He had chosen to protect Lily. Outside, crisp autumn air rustled the leaves across the lawn, carrying the evidence of violence away on a brisk wind. In many ways, that night was the end of everything comfortable and familiar. But in that same breath, it was the beginning of something else. A path to truth, to healing, and to a world where Lily would never again be trapped in silence. Meanwhile, at the police station, Detective Diana Chun surveyed the child-friendly interview room, one she'd seen used dozens of times throughout her 15 years with the Boston PD. Typically, there were plush chairs, soft lighting, and toys or stuffed animals to set children at ease. Yet something about this case felt especially jarring. Perhaps it was the sight of a little boy in an oversized chair, hugging a stuffed dinosaur with heartbreak in his eyes. A social worker had offered Ethan hot chocolate, and he was clinging to the mug as though it might anchor him to reality. Detective Chun spoke in a calm, measured voice. "That's a cool dinosaur," she commented, nodding toward the toy. "What's his name?" "Rex," Ethan said quietly. "My sister gave him to me for my birthday last year." He trailed off, and at the mention of Lily, his grip tightened on the plush. Behind the one-way glass in the observation area, Grace Baker paced the hallway in rumpled scrubs, clearly just off a hospital shift. She looked shell-shocked, speaking rapidly to Dr. Rachel Morris, a child psychologist who often consulted with the department. Turning back to Ethan, Detective Chun asked gently, "Can you tell me why you called 911 tonight, Ethan?" He exhaled a trembling breath. "My teacher, Miss Collins, said, if you think someone is in danger, you have to call. She told us that in class. I should have done it sooner." His voice wavered, a hint of guilt creeping in. "You did the right thing," Detective Chun reassured him. "It's not your fault." "Richard was hurting Lily," Ethan continued. "He's been hurting her for a long time, yelling at her, calling her names, and sometimes more." He hesitated, glancing at the detective. "But at school, everyone thinks he's really nice. Nobody knows." Chun's composure faltered for a fraction of a second. "I believe you, Ethan. And I promise we're going to help Lily." Just then Dr. Morris stepped into the room. "Ethan," she said softly, "your mom is here. She'd really like to see you. Is that okay?" He nodded, sliding off the chair and clutching Rex. At the doorway he turned back to Detective Chun. "Will Lily be all right?" Chun mustered a gentle smile. "She's getting medical care now and we'll make sure she's safe. I'm certain she's proud of you for speaking up." Once Ethan was gone, Detective Chun gathered her notes into a neat file. The preliminary report from the hospital showed multiple bruises in different stages of healing, confirming Lily had been abused over time. There was also a record of repeated emotional and psychological harm. With a sigh, she reminded herself that while this case was difficult, it might finally ensure Richard Cooper couldn't hurt anyone else. In another hallway, Grace Baker sat in a cramped conference room with Dr. Morris, trying to absorb the revelation that had violently shattered her evening. She pressed her palms against her face, her voice tense and trembling. "I work nights. I thought Richard was helping. Cooking dinner, tutoring the kids. I had no idea." "Unfortunately," Dr. Morris explained gently, "people who abuse often take advantage of the parents' trust. They isolate the child, make them feel powerless. And if Richard had a respectable position at a school, that gave him even more leverage." Grace shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "He played the role perfectly, always so patient when I was around, always so polite at parent nights. I never," she choked on her own words. "I should have known." "We'll provide support for Lily and Ethan," Dr. Morris assured her. "We have resources to help your family heal. Lily might need counseling long-term. She'll need time to trust again." Outside, in the pediatric ward of a nearby hospital, Lily slept in a hospital bed, the hush of late-night television murmuring in the background. A small clay turtle, painted in patchy blues and greens, sat on her bedside table with a note in Ethan's unmistakable handwriting. "To Lily. I made this for the art show. Now it's yours. Love, Ethan." The turtle's paint job was uneven, but Lily's nurse had placed it prominently beside her bed, a silent testament to a brother's care. For the first time in weeks, Lily was able to rest, her muscles not drawn tight with fear. She was safe for the moment. Back at the station, Detective Chun finalized her late-night notes. Primary witness, Ethan Baker, age 7. Demonstrated bravery in reporting ongoing abuse. Recommendation: immediate victim support services for both children. Observations: sibling bond is strong, critical for Lily's emotional recovery. The digital clock on her desk showed it was well past midnight, but Chun knew the case was only beginning. There would be depositions, medical reports, charges filed, and more. Yet despite the long road ahead, something fundamental had already shifted. the silence had been shattered. The truth was out, and no one could hide behind Richard's carefully curated facade anymore. The following morning, a pale slice of sunshine fell across Detective Chun's cluttered desk. She opened the personnel files she'd requested from the various schools Richard Cooper had worked at. Each folder painted a picture of a teacher moving mid-semester, always with top-tier recommendations, yet overshadowed by vague rumors. Detective Marcus Torres, her partner, stood beside her, flipping through a folder. "Look at all these mid-year transfers," he muttered. He'd leave just as new complaints were surfacing, complaints that never became official investigations. Chun's brow furrowed. A classic pattern. Probably emotional or verbal abuse that stopped shy of overt physical assault. Until Lily. Seems like he escalated once he felt comfortable at home. Her email chimed with another tip, this time from a former student named Emma Walsh. She was describing how, at 12 years old, she'd found herself singled out by Mr. Cooper, cornered with cruel words that chipped away at her self-esteem. No formal complaint had been filed back then, but the similarities were chilling. "Same script," Torres said grimly, scanning it. "He isolates a vulnerable student, gains their trust, then turns on them." Lily, unfortunately, had no escape. She lived with him. Meanwhile, Dr. Morris continued her sessions with Lily. The girl curled into an armchair, hands hidden inside the sleeves of her hoodie, describing nightmares and guilt. "He told me no one would believe me," she murmured. "And I was so afraid of making Mom upset." At Riverside Elementary, Miss Collins was giving a statement to the principal about her safety presentation. "I never dreamed Ethan would use it so soon," she said, voice shaking. "But if we hadn't covered those emergency steps, he might have stayed silent." A sense of resolution also formed among the school board and parents. Grace Baker, devastated by how Richard had remained undetected, insisted on testifying to ensure stricter protocols. "I need people to understand how he hid behind that teacher persona, how easily it can happen," she declared at a meeting with the district attorney. At the hospital, Ethan finally got permission to visit Lily. Climbing gently onto the edge of her bed, he took in her bruised face with solemn eyes. "Does it hurt a lot?" he asked softly. She gave him a tentative smile. "Not as much now." He brightened, holding out the clay turtle. "I made this for our class art show, but you couldn't come, so it's yours?" "It's perfect," Lily whispered, tears threatening to return. "Thank you. And thanks for what you did." In that quiet moment, as hospital machines beeped softly around them, Grace stood by the doorway, tears slipping down her cheeks for the second time in so many hours. Except now they weren't just from pain or regret, they came from relief and gratitude. Dr. Morris, at her side, watched the siblings exchange a fragile smile and recognized the first steps of healing. For Grace, for Lily, and for Ethan, the coming months would be a journey through court proceedings and therapy sessions. Yet the silence that had once kept Lily trapped was now broken by a brother's bravery. And in the warmth of that single hospital room, they found the first rays of a new kind of hope. Grace Baker's mind whirled with practical worries, the upcoming surgery on Lily's injured wrist, the therapy bills piling up, and the loss of income she'd face while taking time off to care for her children. Yet amid those concerns burned a fierce determination. "I'm not just looking for money," she told her attorney, her tone resolute. "I want systemic change. I want real policies that prevent this from happening to anyone else's child." Her lawyer nodded. "We can push for both, restitution for your family's suffering, plus binding reforms. Mandatory reporting, stricter vetting of staff, consistent follow-through on every complaint." At Riverside Middle School, Principal Martinez stood before the school board, summarizing the conclusions of an intensive internal review. The atmosphere in the conference room was grim, each face reflecting the gravity of the findings. "We've discovered a pattern," Martinez explained, voice steady but low. "Complaints against Richard Cooper were brushed off not just here, but at every institution he served. Whistleblowers, teachers and students alike, were discouraged from making official statements. He transferred from school to school, leaving behind half-finished inquiries." In her ongoing sessions with Dr. Morris, Lily found the courage to talk about the earliest signs of emotional abuse. "He didn't jump straight to hitting," she admitted, twisting a balled-up tissue between her fingers. "First, he chipped away at everything I liked. My confidence, my friends, my love for soccer. He made me feel small, piece by piece, and I started believing I deserved it. But now?" Dr. Morris prompted gently. Lily drew a steady breath. "Now I know I didn't deserve any of it. Ethan, he always saw the real me. Even when I forgot who that was, he reminded me. Meanwhile, at the elementary school, Ethan's class was working on an art project dedicated to heroes. While most of his classmates drew superheroes in colorful capes, Ethan sketched two figures side by side, one taller, the other smaller. When his teacher asked about his drawing, he answered simply, "That's me and Lily." He chose a bright blue marker for the smaller figure's shirt, Lily's favorite color. Back at the police station, Detective Diana Chun studied a growing stack of papers labeled with Margaret Winter's name. Each sheet added yet more evidence of Richard Cooper's carefully orchestrated pattern of abuse. He identified students he sensed were vulnerable, isolated them, and then undercut their self-esteem. A stellar reputation among colleagues had helped him evade scrutiny for years. But not anymore. Testimonies from numerous victims came pouring in. Emma Walsh spoke about the degrading insults that drove her to contemplate suicide. Margaret Winters recalled her struggle to protect her students, thwarted time and again by school administrators. Then there were the Baker siblings, Lily and Ethan, whose willingness to speak had triggered an avalanche of truth. Their accounts were central, serving as both condemnation of Richard's actions and a beacon of hope for all those who had stayed silent. No longer relegated to hushed rumors, these truths were now loud, insistent demands for justice. With them came the possibility of healing, not just for the Baker family, but for countless students who would now be protected under new guidelines and safeguards. The courthouse. On a sunny morning, Lily stood at the foot of the courthouse steps, her hand clasped firmly in her mother's, while Ethan held onto Lily's free hand. The three formed a small but determined chain as District Attorney Sarah Martinez approached. "You ready?" Martinez asked, her briefcase brimming with evidence. Photographs, testimony, medical records, and the meticulous documentation provided by Margaret Winters. Lily swallowed hard. "Do I have to look at him?" she asked. "No," Martinez reassured her gently. "Focus on me or your mom. You've already provided everything we need. Ethan's testimony was so strong that we might not call you to the stand." Inside, Detective Chun sat among a row of Richard's former students, young women who had once been too afraid to speak up. Today they were present to support Lily and each other. Grace squeezed Lily's hand as Richard, wearing a stark orange jumpsuit, was led into the courtroom. He looked diminished, no longer cloaked in the authority of a teacher's role. The opening statement from the prosecution laid bare his crimes. Richard Cooper had exploited his respected position in education to groom, intimidate, and psychologically torment young girls. He'd systematically transferred to dodge investigations, leaving behind traumatized students in his wake. But on this day, those once fragmented voices joined together as a chorus, refusing to remain silent. Margaret Winters took the stand first, her voice thick with years of frustration. She recounted her unsuccessful attempts to raise alarms at each school, detailing how Richard consistently escaped formal scrutiny. Then Emma Walsh, who calmly told the court how Richard's words had driven her to the brink of self-harm. Finally, there was Ethan's recorded testimony from the day before, playing on a screen so the 7-year-old wouldn't have to recount everything a second time. On the grainy footage, Ethan explained in childlike honesty, "Lily wasn't Lily anymore. She was scared all the time. Richard was nice to me when Mom was around but mean when she wasn't. My teacher told us to call 911 if something really bad was happening, so that's what I did." During a brief recess, Lily stayed in a side room with Dr. Morris, doing breathing exercises. "Everyone's so brave," she whispered. "Emma, Miss Winters, Ethan. They all spoke up." "I can't believe it." "They're following your lead," Dr. Morris reminded her. "You showed them it's okay to come forward." After the evidence was presented, photo records of Lily's bruises, doctor's reports, and her own journal entries detailing the abuse, Richard's defense team tried to spin him as a strict educator who'd simply been misread. But the scope of the evidence was staggering, the pattern too consistent. The verdict came swiftly, guilty on every charge. The sentence, 25 years in prison with no chance of parole for at least 15, plus permanent revocation of his teaching license. As they escorted him out, Richard glanced toward the gallery, perhaps searching for a shred of sympathy. But all he saw were his former victims, no longer cowering, each one standing shoulder to shoulder. At the far end, Lily waited, head held high, Ethan still clinging to her hand. Outside, reporters gathered for a statement from Grace Baker about the sweeping reforms the school board had begun to implement. New training, thorough background checks, and real investigations whenever students raised concerns. But the deeper, more meaningful story happened on the courthouse steps, where survivors of Richard Cooper supported one another in the golden morning light. Ethan, doing what 7-year-olds do, tugged Lily's sleeve. "Can we get ice cream?" Startled, Lily laughed even as tears glistened in her eyes. Yes, she agreed, ice cream sounds perfect. They walked down the steps together, hand in hand, leaving behind the courthouse. Justice had been served, but that was only part of the journey. The rest would be healing, a process well underway in each shared laugh, in every supportive word, and in every future day free from fear. 3 months later. On Cedar Street, the wintry chill had given way to a brisk spring. Grace's heels tapped against the sidewalk as she headed home from a mandatory reporting workshop at the local middle school. She stopped briefly to take in the quaint houses along the street, remembering how not so long ago those same sidewalks were strewn with fallen leaves the night the police came. Now the bright green buds and blossoms signaled renewal, a promise of change. "Grace," called Principal Martinez, hurrying to catch up. "The new protocols are working. 2 teachers flagged potential warning signs last week, and we were able to intervene early." Grace exhaled, feeling a swell of relief. "I'm glad. That's exactly what we wanted. No more looking the other way, no more burying complaints." At home, Lily sat at her desk, working on a short essay. The assignment: write about a time you witnessed courage. Words came more freely now. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet, like a whispered phone call when the world feels wrong. "My little brother taught me that sometimes the tiniest voices can make the biggest difference." Her phone chimed with a text from Emma Walsh, reminding her about the upcoming support group meeting. Lily tapped out a quick reply. "Count me in." That group, affectionately dubbed the Truth Tellers, had become a safe place, bringing survivors together and letting them know it was okay to speak up. Downstairs, Ethan sprawled on the living room floor with his math workbook. He looked up occasionally at the commendation on the wall, for exceptional bravery, awarded by the local police department. He claimed he'd simply done the obvious thing: "I just called for help." Yet everyone around him knew that call had saved Lily's life, and in many ways, set off a chain reaction that protected countless others. Detective Chun dropped by for a quick visit, something she'd been doing regularly. She placed a thick folder on the kitchen table. "Updates," she said, smiling as she handed them to Grace. "It's official. The district has approved every policy we pressed for. Anonymous tip lines, thorough background checks, new training initiatives. They've even named the peer support initiative after your family. The Baker Protocol." Grace blinked away tears, remembering how all this started with a terrified phone call from her 7-year-old. "That's wonderful." Lily's still embarrassed by the name, but she's proud too. "She should be," Chun said with conviction. She and Ethan changed the landscape for students everywhere. Upstairs, Lily drew her essay to a close. "Justice isn't just a verdict, it's a promise that will keep other people safe. It's proof that pain can become a reason to fight for something better. Sometimes the greatest acts of bravery come from the smallest among us, and their voices can create waves that reach far beyond one family, one school, or one town." She set down her pen, eyes drifting to the window. In that very spot months earlier, she had watched police cars swarm the street, their lights reflecting on the walls of her bedroom. But now, there was laughter drifting in from open windows across the neighborhood. Children playing. Parents chatting. Teachers who had been more thoroughly trained to see the signs of abuse, and act on them. Spring on Cedar Street. Sunlight dappled the sidewalks, warming the air as Lily slipped on her soccer jersey for the first time since giving up the sport. She caught her reflection in the mirror and paused, recalling the many times she'd hidden herself beneath baggy sweaters. Now she stood tall, her name and number clear on her back. In the yard below, Ethan was already attempting to juggle a soccer ball, shouting for her to hurry up. In the kitchen, Grace set out orange slices for the team, the same way she once prepared meals after exhausting shifts. But there was a difference in her posture now, a sense of relief and confidence that came from knowing her children were safe. As Lily bounded downstairs, Grace and Ethan cheered, and they piled into the car together. No one spoke of Richard Cooper anymore. His name had become an echo of a distant nightmare, one that ended with a courtroom verdict and a stack of new laws to protect students. Detective Chun's updates would come less frequently now that the final sentencing was behind them, but the family stayed in touch, determined not to let these reforms fade away. At the soccer field, Lily stepped onto the grass, heart thrumming with a mix of nerves and excitement. Sophie ran over, welcoming her back with a grin. Practice started, and Lily found herself sprinting, passing, and aiming for the goal, rediscovering pieces of herself she'd thought lost. When she scored, her arms shot up in elation. "That's my sister," Ethan yelled from the sidelines, jumping up and down with unbridled joy. Later that evening, they gathered on their front porch, ice cream cones in hand, watching the sun slip behind the rows of houses. The conversation was easy, punctuated by gentle laughter. A breeze carried the fragrance of budding flowers through the air, and Grace took a moment to appreciate just how much had changed in the past half-year. "You two might be getting a little too good at soccer," she teased, nudging Lily's arm. "Soon I'll have to buy better seats at your games?" Lily smirked. "As long as you and Ethan keep cheering me on from the sidelines, I'll play my best." Ethan grinned, chocolate ice cream dotting the corner of his mouth. "Always, Lils. Always." Grace watched them, her heart brimming with gratitude and pride. She remembered the call they'd received only days ago, inviting them to speak at the governor's signing ceremony for new child protection legislation. Both Lily and Ethan had agreed immediately, eager to share their story so other families could find hope and courage sooner. As dusk settled, the glow of porch lights flickered on up and down Cedar Street. Inside some houses, families were finishing homework and preparing dinner, unaware that their neighborhood had become a symbol of resilience. In others, parents exchanged stories of how their schools now had stronger safeguards. And at the Baker house, 3 people savored a peaceful moment they had fought hard to earn. Different? Yes, life would never be the same as before. But different, they realized, wasn't necessarily bad. It could be safer, stronger, more honest. In the quiet that replaced their old fear, they discovered something precious. The knowledge that whenever someone, no matter how small, dares to speak truth aloud, they hold the power to change everything. Like and subscribe for more videos like this.